Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Murkowski votes to block the release of the Epstein files, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Boomers Being Fools subreddit. And yeah, it looks like a tweet, blue sky post from John Cooper, who says Lisa Murkowski is beyond pathetic, and that was him quote blue skying, I guess, or I'll just say tweeting because blue sky's pretty much Twitter, but only for the woke. But yeah, that was him quote tweeting, I guess, protect Kamala Harris at this about Trump 20. Lisa Murkowski has cast a deciding vote to block the release of the Epstein files. Not just a coward, complicit. And yeah, it just goes to show you how a lot of people who might market themselves as bipartisan, like her, or there's a local congressman in my area. I'm trying to remember his name. He's not my congressional. He's not representing my congressional district, but he represents the one out in Bucks County. Brian Fitzpatrick, that's it. And yeah, they might mark themselves as bipartisan, but they're all owned by the same deep state. And yeah, a lot of Redditors might say, what about the Democratic Party who voted to release the Epstein files? Well, ultimately, if the narrative ever does turn against them, they'll flip too, I would say. They were completely fine with downplaying the Epstein files for Biden's entire term, but now that the Orange Man is supposedly implicated by them, suddenly they're the best thing ever. And that just goes to show you, they only care about whatever the narrative is. They don't care about justice for Epstein and justice for Epstein's victims. They only care about Orange Man bad. Next, we have On Crusades or How Not to Identify with Losers from GoingWithMedieval.com, posted by Maddie O'Clock, and they added a necessary reminder that these Christian warriors, so many people right now are harking back to, were losers. And yeah, personally, I do think the Crusades, they were using force, which the Libertarians are very much against, but ultimately people will justify using force for whatever reasons they want to. If people do want to go on a crusade against anything, I personally think, they should be able to justify whatever they want to as long as they're not hurting anyone else. I very much do feel us as libertarians do need to crusade for liberty, even if, a lot of the woke Redditors might not like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Pfizer Moderna shares follow-on report that Trump officials will link child deaths to COVID shots from CNBC.com, posted by CH4Lux. And yeah, it's personally, if you want to take the vaccine, I think you should be able to. But that being said, a lot of people, just like with any other product, the vaccine is not immune from criticism. If people want to have narratives about it, like that's linked to child deaths, that's on them. Everyone should have the freedom of speech to criticize whatever product they want to. But on Reddit, you increasingly aren't allowed to do that when it comes to the COVID vaccine. It just goes to show you, Reddit is always markets itself as, we're these open-minded, progressive people, but, suddenly you question the narrative on, like, the COVID-19 vaccine, for instance, and suddenly they become the most closed-minded people imaginable, and it's pretty much true of anything that goes against their official narratives. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then next we have Charlie Kirk's allies warn Americans, mourn him properly or else, from Reuters.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I do think, if you want to mourn Charlie Kirk, you should be able to mourn Charlie Kirk. If you don't want to mourn Charlie Kirk, you should be able to not mourn Charlie Kirk. Even celebrate stuff, you should be able to do that. But that being said, if people do want to come after you for your reaction to Charlie Kirk, that's on ultimately people will justify whatever they want to justify. It's just like how the guy who killed him, I think his name was Tyler Robinson, he that day he just felt like justifying murdering him in cold blood, and personally I think that's a NAP violation. But ultimately, if people are going to justify things, it doesn't matter what they're justifying. It's something that people justify. So if people will do what they want to, I guess that's what I'm getting at. Then we have, I can't stand those quote-unquote libertarians who are only anti-leftist, who attack only leftists who promote political violence, but ignore all of the political violence some right-wingers promote, both private and state-sanctioned, posted by Historical Donut 6758, and they added, like some right-wingers are painting all leftists as apologists of political violence because an alleged leftist killed Charlie Kirk, but ignore all the times many leftists were peaceful in interacting with him, and ignored the many times right-wingers justified politically motivated state-sanctioned or private violence, like when most Trumpers on Twitter were justifying Trump killing 11 people on a boat last week. And yeah, my thoughts on that are, I think the libertarian position is you got to be both anti-leftist and anti-rightist, I would say, because both sides are inherently collectivist these days. The woke are very collectivist with all their progressive rules, and the MAGA are very collectivist with all their conservative rules. And ultimately, I would say the libertarian position is, if you want to market yourself as libertarian, you should be able to, regardless of who you go after. Even if you're like a libertarian socialist, even if I personally think that's very contradictory, But ultimately, if people don't think you deserve the label and vocalize and such like this guy's doing, I think you should be able to. But regardless, I do think the libertarian position is you have to go after both left-wing authoritarianism and right-wing authoritarianism. It's kind of cliche at this point, but it is both sides bad. If you want to think one side's worse than the other, completely reasonable. But you do have to criticize authoritarianism from both sides. Just because it's authoritarianism you might agree with doesn't mean it's not authoritarianism. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then we have Free Speech for Me, posted by FlimsyOwl5563, and that's a cross post from the Chaotic Good subreddit. What the fuckity fuck, and that looks like a tweet from Alt US Customs. Everyone needs to report charliesmurderers.com to the addresses below. The site is sharing people's full names, locations, and social media profiles. They now say they're going to be a searchable database, and that they're the largest firing project in history. And that was them quote tweeting Sir Willard Scott. So Squarespace is hosting the site. The domain is provided by Namecheap. Report the site to abuse@squarespace.com and abuse@namecheap.com. Also contact your local congressperson about it. You're right, the site is putting people's lives in danger. And yeah, personally, I don't think, in regards to the databases, I personally don't care for any government databases, but this appears to be a private database, so I'll argue it from that perspective. A lot of leftists have made databases of accounts that they consider to be transphobic or fascist or whatever outgroup label like to throw at people, and Reddit doesn't care. But suddenly right wingers start doing it and they lose their minds. It's interesting because Reddit was completely fine with doxing when it comes to people in the outgroup like libs of TikTok or Stone Toss, but suddenly it's members of the in-group start getting doxed. It's suddenly the worst thing ever, and that just goes to show you that these people don't have any values, only teams. Personally, I think if they're sharing, my personal position is if it's open information, like if they're sharing it under their full name, on like their LinkedIn page, I don't think that constitutes doxing if they're openly sharing it. But I do think if they're sharing it under like a side name, I do think that constitutes doxing, like the libs of TikTok or a Stone Toss, for instance. But regardless, if you want, like for everything else, if people won't justify doxing, that's on them. I personally don't think we should. I don't like how they're building private databases of people. But again, as I said earlier, the left has justified building private databases of accounts that's considered transphobic, fascist, etc., for years, and Reddit didn't care. So ultimately, it's they don't care when it happens to the other side. Why should we care when it happens to them? Pretty much, I should say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the MAGA libertarians are at it again. That's a post from Ragnarok KXG, and that's a post from Being Libertarian. They say, and they post a picture of a tweet from Jack Unheard on Twitter, I think. Breaking a searchable database of more than 20,000 people celebrating Charlie Kirk's murder will soon be available. And yeah, this is just another post on that. It's interesting. I think I had a good retweet on that recently. I wanted to share. It was from an account. Let me see. It was account Corin at Corin Levope, who tweeted, and it's a crying Redditor Wojak kinda. No, I only celebrated the assassination of a political figure. No, don't do the same thing we were doing to you for 15 years and get me fired. No. And it's interesting because Reddit was has historically been for cancel culture for the past, pretty much since the Justine Sacco incident of 2013, when she tweeted, "I'm going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS," and then everyone went to cancel her. But suddenly it's cancel culture is being used against them. It's suddenly the worst thing ever, and that just goes to show you, these people don't have any principles. I'm personally, for freedom of association. If people want to cancel other people, that's fine. But personally, I'm tired of cancel culture from both the left and the right at this point, and wish we could just all be free to say whatever we want to without any consequences. But sadly, that's not the world we live in, and it's very much the fault of the people who are crying about this. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Bezos to DC, drop dead from truthdig.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And that story is, let's see, how the billionaire's bizarre worldview and cosmic fantasies explain the Washington Post's abandonment of its hometown. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Jeff Bezos, but what's interesting? Reddit despises the man, but his newspaper, the Washington Post, is one of their favorite sources, and that just goes to show you, they might say they're against billionaires, but but they seem to exclusively trust billionaire funded legacy media over any independent media, and that just goes to show you, they don't have any principles other than it's like they say they hate multi-billion-dollar corporations, but then McDonald's tweets trans rights, and suddenly they're not so bad anymore. If you get my drift there. Then we have, what the fuck does this have to do with the transgender community as a whole? This is collectivist bullshit, posted by Historical Donut 6758, and that's another post from Being Libertarian, and it's some emoji. I think it's the finger on the face emoji, for the thinking emoji, kind of like this. And he says, there it is now, and then he posts a picture of a tweet from Colin Rugg. Just in, Tyler Robinson lived with transgender partner, according to Fox News at Brooke Singman. The individual who's a male transitioning to a female is fully cooperating with the FBI, Singman reported. The last words out of Charlie Kirk's mouth before he was shot and killed was about transgender violence. And then the OP added, why are so many fucking libertarian pages just anti-leftist pages? And yeah, personally, if they want to make a transgender narrative out of this, I think, people will make whatever narratives they want to. Reddit, is trying to make a narrative that, he was MAGA because his parents were, and that just goes to show you that, people, it's whenever it comes to political violence, it's always going to be the out-group's fault rather than the in-group, and, if Reddit wants to make that narrative, that's fine, but, if they want to... If people want to make opposing narratives, that's fine as well. But if we're up to Reddit, all opposing narratives will be censored, and we'd only have whatever the official Reddit narrative is in regards to, stuff like this, Charlie Kirk's murder in this instance. It reminds me of another tweet I posted. It was another Reddit rage face emoji. This is from Games Notch. He said yesterday, Charlie Kirk was far right, not a moderate, and that's why he deserved to be killed. Today, the killer was far right, and that's why he killed Charlie Kirk, because he didn't like moderates. And it just goes to show you how a lot of the leftist worldview is inherently contradictory. It's like, they say MAGA Trump is literally Hitler. We need to defeat him by any means possible, but also we need to take away all the guns because that they might be dangerous. And it's interesting because if Trump is actually a literal fascist on part of Hitler, he should want everyone to be armed. But it's just stuff like this that show the inherent contradiction of the leftist worldview. And I'm not going to pretend that other worldviews don't have contradictions, but the leftist worldview currently is just full of them, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, when did the modern libertarian movement jump the shark for you? Posted by Historical Donut 6758, and they added, it seemed to be picking up some steam in 2020 and 2008 and 2012 as the Ron Paul's influence. And yeah, personally, I guess the libertarian movement these days, you could argue it's jumped the shark. But, I do think it's because of the lack of any strong figures outside of Ron Paul. I guess you have Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, but they're not necessarily on his level when it comes to media attention, I should say. But, personally, I think the libertarian movement, if you want to make the narrative that's jumped the shark, I think that's fine. But I personally think, it's still, it's like a lot of political movements. There's going to be ebbs and flows over the years. Like, look at the Democratic Party right now. They're pretty much in complete disarray, despite what Reddit would have you believe. But... they'll be back someday, sometime. Like it's politics. It's going to be very cyclical. Sometimes the libertarian movement's going to be very popular. Other times it might not be as popular, and that's okay. Politics will be cyclical. For some things will be popular one day and unpopular the next, and then become popular again. You just have to wait and see. Next we have Hexif says Pentagon tracking service members, civilians who celebrate Charlie Kirk killing from thehill.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for government databases that I said earlier. But ultimately, if the government wants to justify any databases, they have the monopoly and legal support to justify having whatever databases they want to. They've had, and it's not a new issue. The United States has had a census, which is essentially a government database of everyone living in America who filled it out since 1790, and Social Security, the Social Security Act has created a government database of all Americans as well, and that passed 90 years ago. So it just goes to show you that, the government will justify having whatever any databases it wants to. I would add that, if you're not really that libertarian, if you're not at least five of them, I would say. What's the libertarian position? You should probably be on as many as possible if you're actually threatening to their authority. Next we have, well, that definitely shouldn't be where stolen money is used for. He sure as hell is not going to have a searchable database for all of these Trumpers on social media who justified Trump recently murdering those 11 people in that boat without due process. Posted by Historical Donut 76758, and that's looks like a post from Donald Trump for president. And it says, breaking, an online searchable database of nearly 40,000 or more leftists celebrating Charlie Kirk's assassination will soon be available when their employer, The Storm, and then it cuts off. And my thoughts on that are, as I said earlier, I personally don't care for government databases, but, it depends. Looks like a private database, and, ultimately people will justify, if people want to make a database, they should be able to. People will justify whatever they feel like. And, I personally don't really care for any database, I would say, especially ones that people are added to without their consent. But that's how things go sometimes. The left, as I said earlier, has historically created tons of databases for accounts that's considered fascist or transphobic. But suddenly the right starts doing it, and everyone loses their minds, like that old Joker quote from The Dark Knight. Then next we have, why do we still have the LP logo as our subreddit logo, posted by socialists or morons? And they added, the Libertarian Party has been permanently captured by MAGAs. And yeah, I personally designed the subreddit logo. It's the Libertarian Party logo, Libertarian porcupine with duct tape over its mouth. I think Ninja Lover told me that was his idea, and I put it together. And yeah, it just goes to show you, I used to moderate subreddit, and I even designed subreddit logo, and I've been banned for over a year. So it just goes to show you that even if you do a lot for community and are even moderate it and run it pretty much, they can still justify banning you and censoring you for forever if they feel like it. Because one day they kicked me off the mod team because I didn't want to remove comments that by bots because I thought that fell under free speech because I'm pretty free speech absolutist. But they still justified unmodding me and censoring me even if I did design a subreddit logo. With that being said, if you want to have issues with subreddit logo, I think that's fine. If you have issues with whatever you want to. But I personally do like the porcupine as libertarian symbol, and it's not just the libertarian part symbol of the Libertarian Party, it's a symbol of libertarianism as a whole, I would add. So, I personally would keep it, but ultimately, it's not my responsibility anymore since I'm not a mod or even allowed to be active on the subreddit anymore. And if we're up to Reddit, they'd censor my podcast as well. If the moderators of the subreddit could, they would censor me on YouTube as well, and I won't be able to do this podcast anymore. But thankfully, they don't have control over. They only have control over Reddit. This subreddit in particular, but not anything else, because I'm sure if Reddit mods had the ability, they would control the entire internet, and it would suddenly start looking more and more like Chinese internet than anything else. And yeah, it's just I would argue that Reddit, that some things have been taken to be the religion of Reddit over years, like censorship pornography and atheism are usually big things for Reddit likes to worship. But I would argue the biggest thing Reddit worships is censorship of any dissent at all. And that's personally an often libertarian option. You just can't censor all who you disagree with. I'm sure if Reddit, if it was real life, they'd permanently censor a lot of people if they could, just like they did to Charlie Kirk. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.